We usually explain the rise and fall of empires through great rulers, wars, and reforms. But history is not shaped by drama alone. Sometimes it is shaped by a force that moves more slowly and is far less romantic. A force that seems almost boring, but its effects are brutal. Demography. Once you see the logic, you will see familiar history very differently. Demography does not determine history on its own. History is full of examples of smaller, better organized states defeating larger ones. And those are often the examples we focus on. But this is also where the mistake begins, because from those examples, we too quickly conclude that demography is secondary. It's not. Population gives a state its economic and military base. It determines how many people it can mobilize, how many losses it can absorb, and how much power it can sustain over time. When rivals are not separated by major differences in organization, technology, or state capacity, then demographic ratios alone can become so unequal that they start to decide outcomes. And state power is not just about how many people a country has. It also depends on how fast that population is growing, and how large its younger generations are. One of the clearest examples of this kind of shift happened in Eastern Europe. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power, while Russia was still a peripheral and very sparsely populated state. Today we tend to think of Russia as the natural demographic giant of the East, but it was not always like that. The Ottomans had roughly 20 to 25 million people. Russia had perhaps 6 or 7 million, even though its European borders were already not so different from today's. That ratio alone helps explain why no single neighbor could check Ottoman power for so long. Poland, Austria and Russia were all on their own much smaller players. Over the next 2 centuries, that balance changes completely. The population of Ottoman Empire stays roughly at the same level until its collapse. Russia's population, by contrast, grows at extraordinary speed. Around 13 million people by 1700, around 30 million by 1800, and more than 150 million by the start of the 20th century. By that point, it was a completely different game. Of course, demography was not the whole story. The Ottoman Empire was weakening internally. It was failing behind militarily and administratively, while the European powers were reforming. But when the demographic balance shifts on that scale, the very foundation of power changes with it. That helps explain why Russia was increasingly able to push southward in the 18th and 19th centuries, and why the Ottoman Empire could preserve the balance only with the help of other European powers. This demographic weight did not just shape Russia's rise in the 18th and 19th centuries. It also helped Russia survive the catastrophes of the 20th century, losses no other European power could have absorbed. When one state grows to a completely different scale, the old balance starts to look ridiculous. And Russia was not the only case. For centuries, France was the natural center of Europe, not just because of its court, its army, or its culture, but because of something even more basic: people. It was the most populous state in Western Europe. In the High Middle Ages, nearly 1 in 3 Western Europeans was French. Under Louis XIV, France grew past 20 million people. It took a large European coalition to contain its power. The same was true under Napoleon. France's power was not just a product of revolution, military talent, and a new political order. Behind him still stood the largest population base in Europe. France had around 30 million people, and huge younger generations. This is why it could fight war across Europe for an entire generation, and field the largest army of its time. But in the 19th century, something began to change that mattered more than any single war, revolution, or reform. At the time when most of Europe was going through a demographic explosion, France was growing slowly. By the First World War, it had reached only around 42 million people. It had fallen to 5th place in Europe by population. Across the Rhine, Germany had grown from 20 million to 68 million over the same period. At first glance, that gap still looks manageable. 60%, large but not yet overwhelming. But the real scale of this shift appears somewhere else, in the younger generations. In the cohorts that reached military age by the First World War, France had only around 450,000 men, fewer than during the French Revolution. Germany had around 1 million, That is a ratio of almost 2.5 to 1. State power is not just about the total population. It is also about the size of the younger generations. Both states were industrialized, well-organized societies with strong military traditions. But in just 1 century, this demographic shift completely changed the balance of the continent. France could no longer face Germany alone. It had to enter an alliance with Russia, Britain, and finally the United States to stop the rise of German power. We make a mistake when we look at history only where it is loudest, through leaders, wars, revolutions, and new technologies. Major historical change often begins with less visible forces. One of the most important is demography. It is not spectacular like a great battle. It works slowly, and that is exactly why it is so easy to miss. Demography can change the balance between states long before it has become obvious. Demography is not just a question of pensions, healthcare, and the welfare state. It is also the question of power. How large an army a state can raise, how many losses it can absorb, how much economic, industrial, and political weight it can sustain over time. We do not really understand history if we read it only through events. We also have to look at population, its growth, and the size of the younger generations. Without that, our understanding of the past is incomplete, and so is our understanding of the present. On paper, Germany today has more people than it did at the start of the First World War. It has around 83 million. Back then, it had 68 million. But that number is misleading. It hides the real demographic reality and where the country is heading. Germany looks demographically bigger today because its demographic past has not died yet. Large, older generations create an illusion of mass. The real picture appears only when we look at the younger generations. Before the First World War, Germany had cohorts of around 1 million boys a year. Today, Germany has only about a third as many birds as it did a century ago. The cohorts of 18-year-old boys is under 350,000. This is the core of it, and it tells you more than anything else about the strength and vitality of a state. State power is not just about how many people a country has today. It is also about how much future it has in its youth. Germany can still look big, but its future generations are already much smaller. That shows more clearly what Germany will be by the end of the century, unless the current trend changes radically. What is true of Germany is true of Europe on even larger scale. By total population, Europe can still look enormous. The European Union, together with Britain, has more than 500 million people, a number that still looks like a demographic mass of a great power. But once we look at births, the picture changes quickly. In the EU, together with Britain, a little over 4 million children are born each year. That is the continent's real future. And this is where the contrast becomes striking. Today, more children are born in Congo than in Europe. In Ethiopia, the number is similar. In Nigeria, it is almost twice as high as in Europe. That does not yet mean comparable geopolitical power. These states are still limited by low development and weak internal organization. But that is exactly the point. Organization can change much faster than demography. Historical demography does not have the romance of famous battles, great leaders, or dramatic political events. It moves slowly, it moves quietly. That is exactly why it is so easy to overlook. People hear about too few children, but around them, they still see full cities, traffic, and the sense that there are plenty of people. So demography feels like nothing more than boring statistics. It feels like nothing decisive is happening. And yet demography is one of the key forces of history. Without it, our understanding of the past is incomplete. And if we read the past the wrong way, we will certainly get the future wrong too.